Okay, so we're moving on to the build of the frames now. I've got the right hand frame here, and it's important that you realise that the two frames are not identical, they are in fact different. And the easiest way I found to spot the difference between the two is that the right hand frame has a hole in it for the switch, which is one obvious giveaway. The other thing is, if you look over here at the front, the upper hole has got these slats and arrows on it, and the lower hole is a proper servo hole, which it's the opposite of that on the left hand frame. So this is the frame we're going to be building up, and we've got a whole bunch of stuff to put in here, so I'm just going to pull things out a bit at a time and start putting them together and assembling them onto this frame. Okay, so here we have part number one, and this is the front radio tray, and basically where this goes is, you see there's a little cutout here that matches to this, so that goes on there like that, and then it screws onto holes down here as well, so that's got to go onto there, and they provide the self-tapping screws and little silver washers for mounting it up. Okay, and there we have the front tray mounted. I'll just spin this over, you can see it on the other side. There we go, like so. So the next thing I'm going to do is install, there's some little servo mount tabs which go in around the servo holes here, so I'm going to get those, install those next. Okay, so here we have the little servo tabs mounted, and the way these go is that they can only go in one way, and basically you get the bits that stick out at the two pieces that stick out, you push them through the slots in the frames where the servo is, and then they'll basically be flush the other side, with the screw holes flush the other side, and then you put the button head through screw from the outside of the frames to hold it in place with a little bit of Loctite, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to put in is one of the bearing blocks. Okay, so this is the first bearing block I'm going to fit, and this is labelled as R90N831SS, and this is actually the lower bearing block for the main shaft. And then the one in the middle is R90N830SS, and then the one at the top is R90N829SS. But I say this is the lower bearing block, and this kind of goes down here, around about there on the frame, so next to the tank effectively, in that point there. Now the way you put it in is you put it in with the open end of the bearing facing upwards and the closed end of the bearing facing downwards, so that goes in there, and these are the screws to fit it. Okay, so there we have that bearing block installed. So we're going to do the upper bearing block now. Okay, so there we have our upper bearing block fitted. Note the open end of the bearing to the top, and the closed end of the bearing here towards the middle of the frames. So that's our upper block in place. And now we need to put in the middle one, and this is a slightly more complex affair because we need to build that up with the clutch bell and pinion and the starter shaft. So that's what I'm going to do next, show you the build up of that, and then we can install that into the frames. Okay, so what I have here are the pieces to build up our clutch bell starter shaft stack, and the way this goes together is this piece here goes, it will go through there like that. This pinion obviously comes down here and screws into the clutch bell. Just do that gently like that. Then on top of that we have this whole block like that, and then on the top we have our hex starter shaft, and the 2 grub screws there, which are used for holding that in place against the flat that you can see there on the shaft. So that's basically the assembly of the whole thing, and I just need to go through now and make sure everything gets Loctited and put together properly. Incidentally, your clutch liner is actually pre-installed, so you don't need to do that, it's already all done. Okay, so here we have the clutch stack and start shaft assembled. You can see how that goes together. Something else I did while it's at this stage is I've also installed a governor magnet and also a magnet counterbalance in the clutch bell, so I don't have to fiddle around trying to do that later, and I've epoxied those in place so they should glue nicely, and my clutch bell is nicely counterbalanced. So this can now be attached to the other part that goes with this, which is the other bearing block. It's the middle bearing block, and this kind of goes on there like that, and is then bolted into the frames like that. So that's the next thing to go into the frames, is to install that, and I'll come back and show you that in a moment. Okay, so there we have the clutch stack installed. I'll just turn this over so you can see the other side. Okay, there's the other side. Now, one thing to bear in mind on the clutch stack is that the open end of the bearing here is actually down towards the bottom, so it's the opposite of the bottom and the top main shaft bearings in terms of its orientation. Also, take note that when you actually install this into the frames, a lot of these holes here are slots, and what you can do is, if you loosen these screws off, you can actually move the clutch bell backwards and forwards a bit in order to set the mesh on the pinion for the main gear. So you have got some adjustment in here to move the whole thing backwards and forwards to get your mesh correct. So just bear that in mind, don't just tighten these up and forget about it. One last thing that I just forgot to mention also is that the screws here on this side on the main shaft block are 8mm in length, and the ones this side on the clutch stack are 8mm in length, but this middle one, which joins the bearing block and the clutch stack bearing block together, this middle one is 10mm. So make sure you take note of that and fit the longer screw in the middle, otherwise you won't have enough thread on this middle piece to hold it together properly. Okay, so next we have the fun of fitting a tank, and as always the best part of fitting a tank is getting the bung in without it all going wrong and the whole thing dropping through into the tank. So I'll show you how to do that. We've also got these rubbers which go around the outside of the tank, and we need to fit one of those in order to put our tank into the frames at this stage, and we fit another one later. And we've obviously got our pre-cut length of tube here for our clunk. So just a case now of building this up and fitting it. Okay, so here we have our tank with the damper rubber fitted around it, and I've made up my clunk line. The manual gives you a length of about 45mm for your clunk line, and what I've done is I've put the other end of the fuel tubing onto the end of my clunk line, because there's a little trick to installing these into a tank, and basically what you do is you just put that into there like so, and then you get your bung and you thread that onto your fuel tubing. So I'm just threading this on, as you can see, and then the bung you manipulate and push into place, and then once the bung is in place you should then be able to pull your clunk line back through the bung very gently and just work it through, and then you can put the washer and nut on the end to hold it in place. Okay, so I've just done exactly that, pushed the bung into place and then pulled my There we go, like so. Pulled that back through the bung using the fuel tube just to pull it back through, and just kind of work it around, pulling it back through the hole, and it should come through, and job done. And we can just put the, take that off of there now. These grip on pretty good once they're on, which gives you a good purchase. But I can't pull it off. Hold on a second. Okay, just got that off camera because it was on there pretty good. So you can see that's pulled through. Our clunk is nicely in place inside the tank, and we can now put the washer on there like so, and then our nut goes on there as well. And tighten that down, and that's your tank ready for install into the frames. Just need to tighten this up, put some Loctite on it. Okay, well, getting the tank into the frames with the rubber insert on it would prove to be a bit of an interesting episode. Basically, you've got to put a rubber insert into the frames first on its own, and then manipulate and push the tank through the frames. You just cannot get that rubber into the frames if you have it on the tank and then try and squeeze it in some way. So put it in the frames first and then push the tank through the rubber. It will go, it's just a bit of a juggling act. And this is what it looks like from the other side, and you can see our clunk line and our tank breather on the outside there. Okay, so that's the tank fitted. We now move off of page 10, which is where we are currently, actually we don't move off of page 10. At this point we've got to install the engine, which I haven't done yet, so we need to build up the fan and clutch onto our engine, and then we can install it into the frames in here. So just missed that step on this page, but we'll get on and do that now. Okay, so here we have our engine. This is the OS91HZ with the black head on it, and this is what we're going to be using for our Outrage Velocities power plant. And one thing I do want to say at this point is a really big thank you to Midland Helicopters, which is www.modelhelicopters.co.uk, who supplied the engine that we're going to be fitting to the Velocity 90, as well as a muffler. We're going to be fitting a GP Energy 91 muffler to the machine. Really nice black coloured muffler. That one produces really good power when matched to the 91HZ. So this is the motor that's going to go in. We keep the shim on here, and obviously we're going to be using the prop nut as well, but remember to leave the shim on for our assembly of the clutch onto the motor shaft. And that's effectively what I'm going to pull out next, is the parts of the clutch to show you how they go onto the motor. Okay, so here I have the parts for assembling the clutch. Obviously we've got the fan, and the first thing we need to do is we need to put this piece here, which clamps onto our prop shaft, through the fan. So that goes through like that, and then there are a bunch of screws that screw that into the fan itself. Then this whole thing effectively fits down onto the motor shaft like that, and then the clutch goes on top like that. And something we need to look at is that underneath here we've got some screws that go through that basically clamp this piece down onto the prop shaft of the motor, or crankshaft of the motor, and that effectively powers our clutch. And we've got a couple of big bolts that go in the top here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start assembling this up, and then we can look at it in stages as I go through. Okay, so here we have our assembled fan. You see the screws go through from underneath, and this is our top side effectively. And that now needs to be bolted onto our motor shaft using these two bolts. Okay, and there you see that now clamped in place onto our motor shaft. So the next thing for us to do is to install the prop nut in the top here. Just put that in, and that now needs screwing down into there. And you know, you can put some Loctite on that if you wish, just to make sure that doesn't come undone, because it can be quite bad if they come undone. The likelihood is though that Loctite isn't going to work very well on this, because the motor shaft gets very hot, certainly hotter than the Loctite is going to be able to hold on. So best thing really is just to tighten this down well, but if you want to put Loctite on it, then go ahead. Okay, so there's our prop nut installed and tightened up, and you can kind of grab hold of the fan with a towel or something like that to give you something to hold on to it with. And then give it a good tighten up with a socket, and then that shouldn't come undone. So the last thing for us to do, move that there, let's bring that down slightly, is to mount our clutch on here as well. And basically you can see there are, let's get in the right place, there are a couple of holes here, and we put these screws here into those holes with some Loctite, tighten it up, and that's effectively our clutch stack built. Okay, so there you can see the two screws now in place, and the clutch is all installed on there, and it's turning over the engine effectively. Okay, so that's now ready for us to put the fan housing around it, and also build up our motor mount for mounting it into the engine, into the frames. Okay, so here we have our fan assembly, or fan shroud, around our fan assembly and around the motor, and this literally, you just pull this apart and then push it back together around the motor, and that's pretty much it. That's how it goes. So the next thing for us to do is to make up the motor mount so that we can install this whole thing into our frames, and I've got that here. So this is the motor mount, or part of it, because there are two sides to it as well. So this piece and this piece, and effectively these go onto it like that, and then the other one goes on the other side like that, and that makes our motor mount. So I'll bolt that together, and you can have a look at it. Okay, so here we have the built up motor mount. Kind of get an idea of how that goes, and basically this has got some holes on the bottom here. These need to go down towards the bottom because the carbon bottom plate screws to the bottom of the motor mount, so those need to face downwards. So effectively with your engine, which is going to go into the machine kind of like that, the motor mount fits on there like so, and it bolts into place with the usual kind of engine mount screws and washers. So I'm going to bolt that on now, so that we've got the whole thing ready to go into the frames. Bear in mind when you put together the motor mount that there is these screws here are in slots, so you've got some vertical play or adjustment in your mount for raising the engine or lowering the engine, so you get, you know, a really good fit of the clutch into the clutch bell. Okay, so there we have the engine mount bolted to the engine, Loctite on the screws through into the engine mount, and now it's a case of bolting this piece here and the fans assembly itself into the frames. Okay, so the next thing we're doing is I've just loosely put the fan shroud and the engine underneath our side frame, and we're basically going to use these M4 bolts, these short M4 bolts, to bolt through these three holes here to get the engine mount basically into our frames. So that's the first thing. Then once we've done that, The next thing we're going to do is we're going to use this kind of nice neat idea of you've got this retaining washer. Let me just pull this apart. You've got a retaining washer and then this rubber, and the two go together to make that, and then we have a screw that goes through there, and then that whole thing bolts into the fan assembly, as you can see me putting it there or here, and holds it in place in the frames in these inserts. So it's just kind of loosely held on these rubbers inside the frames rather than actually being tightly bolted to the frames. It's kind of a neat idea. So I'm going to mount all of that up and then come back and show you that. Okay, so there we can see our 3 bolts, 1, 2, 3, into the motor mount, holding our motor into the side frame. So the next thing is to put the fan shroud bolts in place. Okay, and if I angle this up, you can now see the 3 shroud holders in place, and of course the shroud is still loose because this hasn't bolted them to the frames. These are just bolted to the shroud, but because of those little rubbers, when the other frame is on, that will all be held in place on those rubbers. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is going to mount up some frame stiffeners. One of them goes at the bottom down here, so I'm going to have to remove this bolt that I've put in. Let's move this across so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to have to remove this bolt here because this one goes in here, and also I'm going to have to remove a bolt at the front because the other frame stiffener, which is this one here, that goes at the front here, and obviously I need that screw to go through up there at the top. So I'm going to bolt these 2 stiffeners into place next. And then we've got to put some cross struts into our frame for the other frame to mount to, so I'll be doing that next. Okay, so there we have one of the frame stiffeners in place, as you can see, and the other one, taken this screw out and fitted that. You can just about see that there as well. So now it's a case of working on the inside of the frames. I'll just turn this in so you can see, and what we've got to do is we've got to put some cross braces in on our frames so that when we mount the other frame to this, we've got stuff to bolt it together. Okay, so here we have our 3 frame spacers, and these are our landing gear mounts, and we've just got to put these into the frames in the right places. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mount these up using the supplied screws that are with them. You can't see those, there we go, see those a bit better. Screws and washers. And then I'll come back and show you them fitted because it's just a straightforward case of bolting them in. Okay, so we have our undercarriage mounts installed into the frames at the bottom here, and then in terms of the frame spacers, there's one here at the front of the fan shroud, then there's one up here by the clutch bell, and then one right at the back here, sort of in the middle hole between 2 other holes. And if I just turn it round, you can see how these are mounted from the outside. So you can see the undercarriage mount, and then the spacer there, and then the other undercarriage mount here, the frame stiffener, the other frame mount here, and another frame mount here. Just move that back here, just there. And that's pretty much it for that particular build step. Okay, our next job is to epoxy a flange bearing into our frames, and this is what the shared CCPM control shaft runs within. So this is the hole in the frames here, and this is the flange bearing, and that's got to be epoxied into the frames up here, and then our shared CCPM shaft can run within that. Okay, so there we go, that's the bearing inserted into the frames. The flange of the bearing is actually on the inside of the frames, so if we turn this around you can see there's the flange of the bearing, and basically just put some epoxy around the flange and then press it through the frames, clear away any excess epoxy and leave it to dry. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be working on are these canopy mount posts. I've taken the liberty of actually installing these metal ends onto the plastic pieces already because it's just very straightforward. The other thing we need to put together is our elevator A-arm on our shared CCPM shaft, and I've got that here in a kind of a partial assembled state. So you've got to put a ball link on the end of a screw here. You can see I've kind of done a bit of that needs some tightening up, and basically you work through like that to tighten that down. That needs screwing up properly. The shared CCPM shaft inserts through this piece, and then you have these screws here which tighten down onto flats on the shaft. So you can see here there is a flat here where the elevator control horn goes, but there are actually two flats underneath here where these small cap head screws have gone in that hold that onto that shaft. And then our A-arm basically then needs to go onto here like that, and we have these button headed screws which go in either side to hold it in place. And then that needs to be inserted through the flange bearing that we installed earlier into the frames and epoxied in place. So I'm going to go through and Loctite this up, tighten up this ball link, and then we can insert this into the frames and bolt these two things into the frames, and I'll show you what they look like on the side frame that we're working on. Okay, so I've now mounted the canopy posts. You can see that at the back here. Canopy posts for the rear, and also if I turn it around to the front, you can see down the front here, canopy post mounted there. If I turn it side on, you can see exactly where that is on the frame stiffener at the front, and you can see at the back here it mounted at the back. The other thing that's gone in is the shared CCPM control shaft and the elevator A-arm. So if I bring this in here we go, you can see, I can take this out just to show you, but there's the shared CCPM control shaft with the elevator A-arm on it, and that's just going through the flanged bearing that we installed like so, and that's basically going to sit there like that. Okay, the next thing that I've been working on is just down at the back here. Let me just show you what we're doing. So down here there's two screws which I've partially installed, and they're going to screw into a little bracket which I've misplaced. Where is it? Okay, here it is. This little thing here. And this is part of the boom support mount at the back of the machine. So this is going to go here effectively on those two screws and be screwed on there, and then the rest of our boom support actually sits in the middle here, the parts of which I've got over here. These chunky things here make up the boom support mount, but those will go in a little bit later. Initially I just need to screw this into place. Okay, so as you can see here, I've now got that little bracket mounted at the back there. We're now in a position to actually install the other side frame onto our completed side frame, and I've got the other side frame here. There's a little bit of prep work that you need to do before you can install it. Mounting up the little servo pieces, which we did on the initial side frame, so those need to be put in place. Then you'll see that there are two lock nuts here, and they're basically securing our governor sensor mounting bracket in place. Aside from that, there's nothing else that you need to do to the side frames, and this can quite literally now be installed onto there. Obviously we've got to get the insert for the tank on there as well before we can push that on, and then we're in a position to try and maneuver this down and basically screw everything that we put on the other side frame onto this one to finish off our frame set. Okay, so there we go, a little bit of manoeuvring, and I've got the other side frame now in place. The shared CCPM shaft is through the bearing there. We've got the tanks around in place, and it's just kind of pushed down and ready for us to put all the various screws in to screw this side frame into place. So that's what I'm going to do next, is basically finish off this side of the main frame exactly the same as we did the first side, and then we're in a position to start working on our tail system. Okay, so here we have our completed frames. This is the side that I bolted on with the governor mount on it, and it effectively is exactly the same as the other side of the frames, just all the screws put in. So it completes our frame set effectively, and you can kind of see how it goes together here, how narrow the frames are. Quite a narrow frame set, to be honest. Something I did have to fiddle around with, because it was really not very clear from the instructions how it went together, was this piece at the back here. Let's just angle this up so you can see this bit here. This is a single metal rod, and it goes in between those little brackets that I showed you mounted at the back here. And to get that in, I actually had to take both of these brackets off and then put the whole thing in with that rod in the middle. But in the instructions this looks like something else. It doesn't look like this, so it's a bit difficult to understand how it goes together. So that gives you a view of how that goes, so you won't have problems with that. Something I missed was putting the little screws in the top of the bearing block here. Got to put those in yet with a bit of Loctite. And then once that's done, we're on to working on our shared CCPM control shaft here, getting our control arms and bell cranks onto the shared CCPM control shaft, and also doing the bottom of the frames and getting the undercarriage and the bottom plate in place, so it will stand on its own undercarriage rather than on the engine as it is at the moment. So I'll do that bit of tidying up, and then we'll be on to working on the bell cranks. Okay, so here we have the bell cranks for the shared CCPM shaft, and these are fairly easy to identify in case, in terms of which one goes where. If you turn them like this, the one with the longest piece here compared to the other one, that's your right hand frame, or right hand side of the frame. The one with the shorter piece is the left hand side of the frame. This is your elevator control horn. In terms of balls, you can see how I've set these up. With regard to ball spacing, what you do here is purely dependent on how big your servo discs are. I've got 24mm servo discs, so I've put the balls on the inside hull, which is the 24mm hull, to give me nice parallel links. But if your servo discs are drilled at 30mm, then you need to go in the middle, and if they're drilled at 34mm, then you need to go on the outside ones. But as I said, for mine I'm at 24mm, so I'm at the inside ones, and then the other ball goes opposite to those. Same for the other aileron bell crank, 24mm, and then this ball here the opposite side. And then for the elevator, if you look at this one, on one side it's got like an extended sort of square piece, and that's the bit that's going to go against the frames. And then you've got a round piece, and that's the bit that's going to be out towards this other bell crank, so it's going to sit like that effectively. I'll try and show you that a bit better. It's going to sit like that. So again, 24mm gap here, and then you've got a couple of grub screws that go in either side that clamp this onto the shared CCPM shaft. So all these need to be inserted onto the CCPM shaft and then bolted into place. Okay, I just want to quickly show you the bolts for securing these into place. There's a little shim, and this goes here it goes on the CCPM control shaft basically before this does. And then you've got these two bolts which are there with their washer, and these basically go on the outside and bolt the whole thing together. So I'll assemble it up and you can take a look at it. Okay, so here we have it assembled. This is the left hand frame that we're looking at here, and you can see that the elevator bell crank is connected to the elevator A-arm, and this is our aileron bell crank effectively, or just a CCPM bell crank. You can see our washer and screw in the end. Our grub screws here on the elevator control have been tightened up against the CCPM shaft, so that's all solid. This obviously is free, but this one is solid and works the A-arm. And then the opposite side, we've got our much longer shaft effectively. Okay, so if we look at the bell crank on the other side, we can see that there's a little tiny shim underneath here and our screw and washer on the end, and of course this is free to rotate. And that's the shared CCPM control shaft completed. So the next thing to do is to put an undercarriage on, and I'm not going to bore you with the assembly of an undercarriage. I'm just going to put the undercarriage together and then we'll just have a look at how it bolts to the underside of the frames.